This is Average Joe Rock and Roll. I am Michael J. Rock, and I am joined on the virtual couch today by David. Welcome, David. How are you?
Hey, Mike, thanks for having me. I am
Absolutely.
fantastic. I'm sitting here, beautiful weather outside. It's great.
Yeah, fantastic. What's your music guilty pleasures these days?
You know, it's funny. When I knew I was doing this program with you, I went through probably about 20 different albums for about half a night on my day off. And I just kind of was thinking about my grandfather and his love of music, and it was all jazz and it was all blues. So it kind of got me like back into that mode. I actually have this Yakety Sax Man album that he gave me eons ago, and it just amazing. It doesn't matter what era. It just musicians today, and even back then, it just was phenomenal music.
Sure.
Didn't need words. So,
Yep. Yeah. Yeah.
but
So
yeah, I've been. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
no, I was gonna say, are you listening to any the more modern stuff or the older stuff?
No, I didn't. No, it's funny. I tried to span this whole, because I knew I was going to be talking to you today. I tried to span this whole thing of music. And so I went through all the albums from when I was a kid and who influenced me, the Beatles, the Animals, Allman Brothers, Leonard Skynyrd. And I'm not a real new hip hop. I am very classic rock and roll.
Yep.
And as you know, and
Yep.
I loaded up. I was on a trip with a friend of mine for the last few days from work, and we loaded up the CD player. And I was like telling him, I said, "Yeah, my friend and I are going to talk today," and we talked a lot of music. So yeah, it was pretty cool.
Yeah, and it's amazing those bands that you mentioned, like the Beatles and the Animals, and even the Allman Brothers and Skynyrd, the influence that those bands have had on everything that's out today, or a lot of what's out today. It's amazing when you listen to different people talk about early influences, how they bring up some of those names. Everybody talks about the Beatles, but occasionally, you'll hear the Skynyrd, you'll hear the Allman Brothers.
Yeah,
And sometimes it's from bands that you would never suspect that they were influenced by Skynyrd.
right on.
Yep.
Well, it's funny is I was gifted from all my sisters, other than my one sister who's sending me her whole record collection. So I kind of grew up listening to three sisters worth of music too, which gave me a different perspective as well. Because even if it's some sappy, I grew up in the '70s, so in the '70s it was totally all one hit wonders, and then when I got to high school, it was all big hair bands. And but the music and the artistry is just amazing. I listened to an interview the other day, an old interview of Greg Allman, and he was talking about newer groups, and he was talking about of anybody that I surprised me was the Foo Fighters. And he said, he goes, they're loud and they're this, they're that, but he goes, you know what? He goes, they're incredible musicians. I love listening to them. So, I think sometimes too, and obviously that was probably a 15-year ago interview, but ironically, I think, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Ironically, for a guy like Greg Allman to say, "Wow, the Foo Fighters kind of influenced me on some of my newer stuff," it just goes to show you, music is music. It's the degree of talent.
Yeah. Yeah. I couldn't agree more. It's it's funny that you mentioned Greg Allman with the Foo Fighters because that's two completely different types of music. The Foo Fighters are heavy. They do have a different style of music than Greg Allman, but Greg Allman, if you think back to like when he was with the Allman Brothers and stuff like that, and then we later on in his career, um, he experimented a little bit, and he didn't necessarily, I don't think, fall into one genre. So, it's
Absolutely.
it's kind of surprising on one hand to hear that, but on the other hand, it's not that surprising. Obviously musicians recognize other musicians' talents. I there was, I don't know if you follow Toto at all. But a couple years ago, the band Weezer did a cover of Toto's Africa, and Toto responded.
Really?
Yeah, yeah. And Toto responded by doing a version of Weezer's Hash Pipe. And it's
Oh,
pretty cool.
wow.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. You can check that out on YouTube. But
Yeah,
that just goes to show you, like, you would never think that Weezer would do a Toto cover. Like, where did that come from? But
yeah,
it worked.
yeah,
It sounded great. And then when Toto responded with doing Hash Pipe, it sounded great as well. Talented is
yeah.
talent.
Well, it's like which I find this aspect of it that I find interesting is I'm not a big fan, as you know, of hair bands, of 80s bands. But I've learned through listening to your knowledge, I've learned that, you know what, you may not, I was thinking about, don't laugh, but I was thinking about Bret Michaels.
Yep.
And what I was thinking about was, it doesn't matter what band you're in. If you can sing, you can sing. And you know what? I may not be a Poison fan, but that guy can sing. He's got a great voice.
Yeah.
So it doesn't matter what era you're from. It's just freaking talent. It's amazing to me. And, and that's the other thing I was thinking about. I could see, obviously Greg Allman's dead now, but I could have seen him doing an album at some point just through this interview. It was with, can't think of the guy's name, but it was like classic music or interview. And it was the first time actually that I watched an interview that the guy actually asked really good questions to pull stuff out of him. But yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But I mean, you're the one that turned me on to like the guitars from Autograph or Cinderella, or it's just pure talent.
Yeah. Yeah. It's amazing how overshadowed a lot of that music became because of the look. If you didn't have the big hair and you didn't have the makeup, you were nobody. And
Yeah.
and the reality is that's just plain silly, because some of these guys were so talented. And I mean, I think of like a band like Winger, and Kip Winger will admit it to this day, that what, he was a pretty boy. He had the look, he went after the look. And you know what, that band fit right into the 80s scene because of the look. But the reality is those guys are not only super talented musicians, they put out some great music. Kip Winger himself has written symphonies and just done a lot of stuff outside of what you would think Kip Winger would do.
Right. Yeah. Well, yeah. And it's funny is I say I don't really, it's not my era, but if I hear a song, I think every band though back then, for me, this is just me, but there was always at least one or two songs that you'd sing to or you'd get into. So it didn't, you know what I mean? If they didn't tell you this is Quiet Riot, you're still going to be into it when they're playing their hit songs.
Yeah.
So it's not like it's not, it just, yeah, no, I hear what you're saying. Well, that's like, and I thought of you a couple nights ago because I got home, I was watching a couple things on YouTube, and I watched an interview with Lita Ford. And I'm not, I don't really, other than she did a duet with Ozzy. And
Yep.
And what I didn't realize is she's actually a really good guitarist.
Yeah.
And there are a couple other people that had like drop-ins in this interview. And because I tried to watch a bunch of interviews before you and I talked too, just to kind of, but what turned me on to it was, it's amazing because I think to myself, God, she can't play guitar. But then you watch these videos and stuff, and granted, it's Hollywood, but she's great. So it's not, it's kind of like heart, you just, you don't maybe expect it, but there are some great female guitarists out there too. And the girl who you turned me on to, and I can't think of her name, there was one girl who you turned me on to, guitars. But there's some great female guitarists out there too.
Yeah, there absolutely is. And Nita Strauss is probably who you're thinking of.
That's the with right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of, so you think of like Nita Strauss, another one, the one that was in Alice Cooper before her, Orianthi, was another great guitar player. There are a lot of great female guitar players out there, and we're getting to the point now, which is fantastic, where, you know what, Nita Strauss is called out as being a great guitar player. She's not being called out for being a great guitar player for a girl, and there was a time when people would have said, yeah, no, for a girl, she's a good guitar player. Well, the reality is great guitar player is a great guitar player. And when Guitar Player magazine puts her on the cover as one of the best, they don't put her on the cover as one of the best in the female world. They put her in as one of the best in the world, and she is, and that's how it should be discussed, because there are some phenomenal female musicians, and the reality is it's a male dominated world, hard rock and heavy metal, but that's not because there aren't some great talents out there that are and a lot of those great talents are starting to break in now and starting to become part of that scene, because the reality is that there is no mold anymore. There used to be a mold. There is no mold anymore.
Right. Well, Clapton said it a while back. I saw a clip on Clapton, and Clapton, someone asked him, he said, well, what do you think about, and it was really funny because the interviewer was like, well, what do you think about the influence of all these women now in rock? And Clapton was like, he goes, well, there's always been women in rock, but he goes, people get so stereotypical of what a rock guitarist should be. And I to be honest with you, I can't remember the name, but he like reeled off like 4 people. And he said, you know what? He goes, I would take these 4 women, he goes, in my band just as much as I would Jimmy Page or Jeff Beck. He goes, no, I'm not saying they're necessarily better, but he goes, they're different, and they're just as good as some of these other guitarists because they work at it. So yeah, it's interesting. Yeah.
He probably mentioned Bonnie Raitt. She's another one that super.
Oh, she's a slide guitarist.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you know what? I literally have had, so Bonnie Raitt toured with Eric Clapton, I don't know, probably 15 years ago or whatever. And I had 2 or 3 different friends that saw that tour, and all of them said Bonnie Raitt was better than Clapton. Now, she's definitely not more talented than Clapton, but you know what? That was the stage presence, and that was the vibe that she gave off in the show, and that was the perception, that Bonnie Raitt better than Clapton. Imagine that.
Yeah, that is pretty incredible. Well, she is a talent. I mean, that girl is a talent. I saw her in Saratoga back in 80. I'm dating myself now, Mike. 86, and she was just, she did a couple of acoustic not acoustic, but just no words, and she just the music, and that girl can play. She even played steel guitar. She played a bunch of different stuff, guitar wise. She played the mandolin and the banjo, and just and she's one of the rarities that can do hard rock, or maybe not hard rock, but harder rock, and then can do a ballad, and it's so smooth. That's another thing I think of musicians, and what makes a good musician is the guy that can transition into other songs. Because I bet you if you gave Ozzy, maybe this is the wrong example, but I think if you gave Ozzy, I think Ozzy Osbourne could sing anything. He'd have to work at it. But, it's because I was having this discussion the other night with a friend of mine about, God, the guy has every Ozzy Osbourne everything. And we were talking about it. And he said, Dave, he can sing anything. because I said, yeah, I said, I'd like to hear him sing Sky Pilot by the Animals. And he
Yeah.
said, it wouldn't sound, it wouldn't be the same, but it would be quality. So,
Yeah.
anyway, just a
I remember
side note. I thought that
first
was
time
kind
I heard Ozzy in the 80s. It was like maybe, I don't know, 84 maybe. It's the first time I heard him. And
of,
the first thing I thought of was how unique his voice was and how different it was. Um, but yeah, he's certainly in his latest album. I don't know if you've heard it or not, but his latest album, he's got a ton of
I haven't.
guest players on there. And one of the guest players he has on there is Eric Clapton,
Oh,
and they do a
cool.
song together. So it's a pretty good album.
Oh, I'll have to check that out.
Yeah, yeah, it's a pretty good album. I can't remember what it's called, but it's his latest one. It's been out maybe a year now. He had Jeff Beck on there.
Yeah. Wow.
Uh,
Really?
yeah,
Oh,
yeah,
wow. I
yeah,
will check that out.
yeah,
Well, it's funny is you listen to all these interviews like Sharon Osbourne, and I don't mean to make this an Ozzy Fest thing, but it's interesting because you listen to Sharon Osbourne in some of the I love interviews, and you listen to Sharon Osbourne in some of these interviews, and she's always said, she goes, as messed up as he was on alcohol and drugs and whatever, she said the one thing he never lost was his voice.
yeah,
And and and, and it kind of goes back to the beginning of our conversation. If you got the voice, you got the voice.
yeah,
But as eventually you look, depending on what you're doing to your vocal cords, you take someone from like I'm trying to think of someone. I mentioned someone the other day. It's kind of like Bob Dylan. Well, Bob Dylan's a bad example. You could never understand him, but there are some singers that just don't like the John Bon Jovi thing. There,
yeah,
that
yeah,
just unfortunately eventually they're
yeah, yeah. No,
yeah.
and some
But,
of them just stay
Mike,
away
who influenced you on the way up? Who when you were in high school? Who were the bands you were listening to? Was
uh
it Winger and things like that?
I so eventually, but probably Winger was probably more out of high school. In high school, I had discovered early on, I had discovered like Judas Priest, and stuff like that. Some of the British metal stuff, Black Sabbath. Um, but there were three bands that I listened to over and over and over again, cassettes front to back, and those were Twisted Sister, Rat,
Yeah.
and Motley Crue. Those three bands I just couldn't get enough of, and I just listened to those tapes over and over and over again. That was in high school, and then once I started to get out of high school and stuff like that, I branched out, and I became an Alice Cooper fan, and Kip Winger and Paul Taylor were an Alice Cooper, and then they went out and started their own band Winger, so then I became a Winger fan and stuff like that. So, but those, and
Yeah.
then and when I got out of high school, I was probably a senior, maybe 1 year out of high school. I had a van, and I put a cassette player in this van. I wasn't, super mechanically inclined. Somebody gave me this cassette player. This van was in such rough shape it had a rip in the ceiling. I took this cassette deck and I shoved it in the rip in the ceiling, right? And then I ran the wires down and hooked it up. And I had two cassettes in there that I listened to over and over and over again. Those two cassettes were TSOL Hit and Run and Aerosmith Done with Mirrors. And if you've never
Oh,
heard
great
Aerosmith,
album.
you know that album, Aerosmith Done with Mirrors.
Yeah.
Uh,
Oh,
Not a lot of
fantastic.
people like that album, but I love that album. Loved it. I love the song of The Reason a Dog. I love the line, The reason a dog has so many friends because he wags his tail instead of his tongue.
I like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I saw Aerosmith back in God, I was in high school, so I want to say back before they got finally Steven Tyler got sober for the 15th time. But even back then, as messed up as they were great. I mean, up until he's passed out on stage, they were great. But yeah, that's a great. Oh, I hadn't thought of that album. I'll have to play that. That's a great album.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah. No,
Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was just gonna say that was back then, that was one of my favorites, but that was, like I said, that was more out of high school. In high school, I was pretty much pigeonholed to those three bands. Another band that I listened to a lot, that I really liked a lot, was Ronnie James Dio, some of the Dio solo stuff.
Well,
Um,
I learned about Ronnie James Dio, because my friend and I, when we were traveling back up yesterday from Massachusetts, I was trying to give him a thumbprint of history, and we were talking about Rainbow, and he said, "Oh, I never heard of Rainbow." And I said, "Yeah," I said, "Richie Blackmore started the band." And for some reason, I thought, and you might be able to correct me on this, but for some reason, I thought Randy Dio became the lead singer of Deep Purple when Richie Blackmore left, but it was the exact opposite. Randy Dio was the lead singer of Rainbow. And so you never know until you really kind of research some of this stuff too.
Yeah, Rainbow had a bunch of lead singers. They did have Ronnie James Dio at one point, but they also had Graham Bonnet. They had Joe Lynn Turner. Um,
Really?
yeah, yeah, yeah. So they
Oh,
had,
wow.
but you know, Richie Blackmore um, isn't the easiest person to be around. You know, and that's not a secret. You know, that's a fact. And um, you know, a lot of people couldn't really hang around him too long because you know, there were conflicts, and you know, he had to run things, and they had to be things had to be his way, and he wasn't always vocal. You know, he got moody. So some people would just be like, yeah, you know what, I'm done after this. And I suspect that's why they went through so many singers in Rainbow. But you know what, Ronnie
Yeah.
James Dio left there and he did his solo stuff and he did just fine. You know.
Oh, you know what? For a little guy, he was one talented little guy.
Oh, and you know what? That guy could sing. I saw him
Oh,
live in like 1987, 88, and boy, could that guy sing. His live show was phenomenal.
yeah. You know, it's funny. I never realized, and I'm by far no great music expert, but yeah, that's kind of like that whole thing with when you told me about him taking over for, you know, I never knew that he took over for Ozzy Osbourne with Black Sabbath. So
Yeah,
I mean, so he was obviously one very talented guy.
yeah, yeah. He was in a band called Elf, and he actually played bass in that band. He was a bass player, and he went from Elf to Black Sabbath, and you know, and Elf's music is nothing like Black Sabbath. It's different. It's not bad. But that's how he started. He started as a bass player.
Oh wow, yeah. So yeah, you know, it's funny. You were talking about influences and asking me that earlier, or what I'm listening to, and you know, I'm kind of until I discovered, and you'll laugh at this, but until I discovered YouTube, so I could go back in this catalog, and that's all I've been doing lately. Is I get home, I plug my phone in, and I just make a mix of what I want to listen to. But you know, I'm kind of a stick in the mud when it comes down to core bands. But I love new music. I remember one time you had you had done a the Shakes, the Alabama Shakes, and I would have never have discovered them if you didn't burn me that CD. But you know, there's another band which we haven't heard from, but that's a different direction of music, but it's still the same. I don't know why I keep harping with you about talented musicians, but yeah, it's just amazing how much music is out there.
Well, I think so when you become a deep music fan as opposed to just kind of the surface fan, um,
Yeah.
you know, you do get excited about, you know, talent. You do get excited about, you know, hearing the backstories and, you know, who's in what and who did what and who collaborated with who. And you just, you know, we all become geeked out on that stuff because that's exciting to us. Other people, it's like watching paint dry, but, you know, to us, it's, you know, exciting stuff.
Yep. Yeah, they yeah, no, I agree. I agree. I definitely agree. And you know, that's why, you know, I never really saw, you know, I always went to different stuff when I was a kid. And probably if my sister's boyfriend was more into what was going on in the 80s, I probably would have become a bigger winger and those type of music fans, you know. But but yeah, it's pretty amazing. The other thing that just kind of stuck in my head is, isn't it amazing? You think about it. We're talking about the Allman Brothers and Leonard Skinner, and you're talking 30 years ago, 40 years ago. So you know what? Good music lasts.
Yeah.
It's not gonna go away.
Yeah, I'm gonna blow your mind
Like
because
AM radio.
I'm gonna blow your mind because it's actually been 50 years since Skynyrd put out their first album. Actually, it's been a little over 50 years. It's probably
Wow.
52 years. Yeah, no, it's crazy. It's yeah, time just rolls,
Yeah.
and that was a
You
band.
know what's funny is,
Go ahead.
go ahead. No,
I was
all I was going to say was that's one of the albums when I was a kid. There were two albums when I was a kid talking about always playing. I I could I could second helpings.
Yep.
I played that thing until I had to buy a new album. And when they came out, I think I was in sixth grade maybe when they came out with their greatest hits album right before Streets of Fire. And those two albums I played relentlessly. I mean, they were not the greatest hits album is the greatest hits album, but second, how you think about the first, you and I have talked about this. You think about the first two albums those guys did, and lost you.
Yep, I can hear you.
Hey, Mike, sorry I lost. Oh, there we go. No, but anyways, those are the two. I listen to that and Beatles Abbey Road, and I used to have friends come over and tell me, with that little mode of when they do like the Mustard King and Here Comes the Sun. There's that. I can remember Tommy Berry, this kid I grew up with, that would come on and go, "How can you find this music?" And I would be like, "How can you not find this music?" But he was into Kiss, he was into Meatloaf, he was into all this other stuff. So, but it's still music.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, those going back to Skynyrd, so the original Skynyrd band. Well, I shouldn't even say the original Skynyrd band because they changed players a few times throughout the years. But the Ronnie Van Zant years before the plane crash, every single studio
Yep.
album they put out was phenomenal, and everyone was great from front to back. No clunkers, no fillers. That band was just, it's too bad that it ended when it did because the future, was bright, and can't even fathom what the albums would have sounded like going forward as those guys only became more seasoned.
Oh well, they had got. Oh yeah, and then when they hooked up with one of the backup singers, I'm trying to think of his name, her brother, and he did that last Streets of Fire album with Ronnie, and it kind of like got him right back into hit mode and stuff. Yeah, you're absolutely. And then when they had the three girls there, the three songbirds, that was just yeah. It is too bad because I think they would have put out some really incredible stuff.
Well, you think about the last album that they did, Street Survivors. You think about the songs
Yep.
on that album. Um, What's Your Name? I Know a Little. I mean, that, like I said, no clunkers, and those songs were all phenomenal. And half
Yep.
they're still playing
Yep.
live today, even though now it's essentially a cover band. It is a cover band. Gary Rosington's gone now, so
Yeah, well, now it definitely is because Rosington passed away,
right.
so there's
Yeah,
no original members left.
yeah,
So yeah, it's funny. And some of their ones that are on the album, Greg Allman said, he goes, he was talking about Skinner, and he said, you think about all the hits off that first album,
right.
but he goes, my favorite song is Tuesday's Gone, and he goes, you're never going to hear that on the radio, but he said, you know what? That's in my top 10 songs. He said, Tuesday's Gone is right there. And
Yeah,
that surprised me a little, though he did play for their special. They had a special about 5 years ago, and all these bands came in and played Leonard Skinner music. And it was ironic that he did Tuesday's Gone when he came in to perform.
yeah.
So it just goes to show you, you can have a home run. But they say those guys, when they were in the swamp, they say those guys played every single day for like 20 hours. I don't know if you've ever seen any of the biographies on them
Oh, yeah.
or things, but they were just very focused musicians. who came from nothing.
Right. Yeah. 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 Their name came from their gym teacher, Leonard Skinner.
Yeah,
Was
that's right.
yeah. So so unfortunately, we are running out of time here.
Oh, Mike, thanks so much for having me on. This is great.
Yeah, it's been fun catching up on some music and talking about what excites us. Thanks for joining me on the virtual couch. And with that, I am Michael J. Rock. I am a rock fan. Enough said. Thank you, David.
Take care.